Hello, friends. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos, where we discuss communication with people who are different than you. And since we're all unique, that's pretty much everyone. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos. I have Gary Simonds with us today. He is a neurosurgeon. He's a professor. He's an author and a speaker. Gary, welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jeremy. That's truly my pleasure.
And what a wide range of things you do. It's pretty exciting that, people who are surgeons can also write fiction novels. So it's pretty entertaining that you're able to do all those sorts of things.
Well, thanks. I made it easy because I put down the knife a few years ago now for a series of reasons. So I had a lot of time to kill.
Nice. And it's good that you're not doing surgery now that you're using the word kill.
Yeah, we probably use language like that a little too freely.
Speaking of language, one of the reasons why I'm excited to have you here is that surgeons and doctors in general are not necessarily known for being the best communicators, especially the more specialized they get. It seems that the less able they're able to communicate with regular humans. Can you tell me more about that? And has that been an issue in your experience?
Yeah, it's a major issue, and I definitely have gone on my high horse about it many times through the years. I think it actually starts maybe nowadays way back in high school, but certainly in the college years of pre-med, all the pre-meds who have to jump through so many darn hoops just to get into medical school. So I think while their brains are developing, while their personalities are developing as adults, all of a sudden they're stuck in libraries and stuck in labs, and they're not interacting with normal people. They're not interacting with anybody, except maybe some of us idiot professors, right? So I think at a really critical time in life when they really should be interacting with all sorts of people and learning the nuances of communication and learning the dance of interacting with people of all stripes, we're isolating them. And then you get to med school and you're bombarded with, it's nonstop learning, but really part and parcel to what you're learning is a whole new language. I mean, the whole thing of medicine, I used to give tours of our medical school when I was there, and that was the first thing I would tell the prospective students is if you look on medicine as learning a new language, it all becomes much easier. But we're learning that so that we can talk to each other in the most efficient of terms. So if I say to another doc, this patient has a STEMI, I don't even have to say ST elevation myocardial infarction. I just say they're having a STEMI. They know exactly what I mean, and a whole series of information downloads in their heads. But that does nothing for for a patient or a family member who I'm speaking to. And so what happens is we're so used to speaking in that language that if we don't stop and translate it, we're doing the patients a huge disservice. And it is a busy world. It is a busy life. And so it's just so much easier for a lot of docs to just spew the technical language and leave the poor patients and their families in the dust. And what we really work on is trying to get people to slow it down, to interpret, to educate through their speech, to bring people up as much as possible to what they're getting at.
Is that something that's now taught in schools, or that is on the job figuring it out, how to make that translation back and forth?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's still a lot of OJT. I think med schools are, various med schools are doing a better job at least beginning to address it. And the one that I teach at Virginia Tech Carilion, it really does work with the students a lot. They do mock patients and actually have them speaking to patients in front of the instructors and all. But it was never a part of the real educational process. In my residency, I ran a residency there at Virginia Tech Carilion as well. And we did mock patients all the time and worked on people's communication skills, because I think it's one of the most important things that we do as a physician. Yes, you want your surgeon to be competent and good at what they do, but I always said we can teach almost anybody how to do the operation. It's all the other stuff that matters.
It's so interesting. And my background's in engineering. And what I found is the way engineers are trained actually makes it harder for them to communicate, because when they're going through school, they are forced to tell you every step and all of the background information, or you don't get full credit on the exam. And then you get into the real world and no one wants the whole backstory. People want the answers. They don't want to know how to build a watch. They just want to know the time. So their training actually makes it more difficult for them to communicate the way most people like to.
For anybody kind of in a high demand, high technical world, this same phenomena potentially is going to happen. And I've heard tell often of people in other industries where some leader in the field will come in and then just lose everybody within a few minutes of some presentation or some discussion.
And then, so that is the case for surgeons. And then on top of that, you also are having very emotionally charged conversations with people from time to time, which is a whole nother set of skills that is rarely taught. How often does that come up where you have to talk to people about, something that's going to change their life?
It's a great question. In my field, particularly in the type of practices that I was in, it is stunningly common. So I've always worked in these big medical centers with trauma centers and the helicopters coming in. You had to remind yourself that every one of them, and they were coming in all the time, every single one of them held somebody whose life had just been absolutely turned upside down through illness, through injury, through whatever. And so when you go to talk to a patient and or their family, particularly in my world, it was often their families, because the patient was compromised one way or the other, in coma or badly injured and stuff. But when you would go talk to the families, you had to understand that right up front, that their whole world has just been turned totally upside down. And on a given night, we usually saw anywhere from 15 to 25 emergency consults every night. I mean, you were talking to that many families, no matter whether you had to operate or not. And often in one night, you would tell several families that their family member was dead or dying or in coma or paralyzed or has a new brain tumor or something like that. So it was, like I said, stunningly frequent.
I can't even imagine the amount of stress that must bring on. And how did you learn to communicate in that type of situation? Or what are some things you did learn that you can maybe share with people who are having maybe not quite that challenging of a conversation, but an emotionally charged one?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we don't all have to tell family members that somebody's paralyzed, but we all do deal with stressful situations, and life moves on, and it's not always smooth, for sure. And I think the better we are at that sort of communication, the better it is for everybody. And I think one of the best pieces of advice is to not dive in, meaning you recognize you have to have this conversation. Don't walk into it 2 seconds later. Actually pull yourself aside somewhere. And in the hospital, I would tell the residents, if it means going and stepping into a closet, just go somewhere with your own thoughts, think about your opening salvo at the very least. How am I going to open this conversation? What are my goals? Go in armed with some goals for the conversation, and don't make them too numerous, because there's only so much you're going to accomplish in one conversation. If you can even give yourself a minute of role playing, even by yourself, hear the words come out of your own mouth. I think that is one of the more stunning things in a conversation that's fraught, is hearing your own words in space, and they just kind of hang there, and you're going, oh my gosh, can I pull that back? So if you can even say a few things out loud in that closet and hear what it sounds like, what it feels like, to release them, I think that goes a huge way, rather than just going in and shooting from the hip and hoping that it works. Obviously, the more you do it, probably the more facile you become to it, if you're evaluating it all the time and thinking about what you've said. But yeah, that would be the kind of the first step, and from there are many different components to it, but obviously honesty is huge. People, it's interesting, but in fraught situations, I think we tend to like to tiptoe. Mm-hmm. and I don't want to actually say what I really mean or what I really need to say, because it's going to hurt, or because they're going to get upset, or because I'm going to get upset. But I think we tend to tiptoe, and all of a sudden we start shading the reality, and maybe not get across the key points. And yet, on the other hand, we don't want to come in with a sledgehammer and just start swinging away. So we got to have a level of empathy and compassion before we launch into our deep honesty. I also think a huge part, which we're terrible at, and I'm terrible at to you right now, for example, I'm just rambling on, but this is one of my more favorite topics. But I think we have to listen. And mm-hmm. I would open up most of these conversations by introducing myself, establishing kind of who I am and what my bona fides are here, because they need that. But I would then say, please, can you tell me what you understand about, your loved one's condition? What do you know is going on? And just stop and shut your mouth and hear them. And you can gain so much. One, you know what they know, you establish what they know, but you also start to establish what's their level of sophistication. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, what do they actually know about the medical world, for example, in medicine? And how am I going to have to adjust my conversation so that they can best understand it? And listen, even to their emotional set points at this point. Are they angry? Are they terrified? Are they optimistic? Are they, get a read on their emotional status. And you can get so much, again, just by shutting your mouth for a little while and listening. And at least in my world, we're always feeling hurried. So you're kind of like, oh, geez, I got to get this over with, because I got to go talk to the next family. But sometimes you just have to say, no, it's got to unwind itself. And if it takes time, it's going to take time. Those would be a few of my opening recommendations.
Yeah, those are great. And going back to just stopping and preparing yourself, that's something that is useful for all of us. Yeah. So many times, if there's a heated situation and you just go right into it, it's not going to go well. If you can just step back and kind of gather yourself, it goes such a long way. And then you talked about actually saying things out loud and hearing it. That goes such a long way too. It's amazing what a change in tone of voice does to the message and the way it's received. I know that when I was in sales, one thing that I would always tell people is don't flinch when you say the price. If you kind of verbally flinch when you say it's $10,000, all of a sudden that looks really, really expensive. And if you just say it's $10,000, then people take it for what it is. So catching yourself and making sure that you have the appropriate tone of voice really does go a long way.
So what am I buying for $10,000 here, Jeremy?
What would you like?
Just don't flinch.
Nope, no flinch.
No, I think it's a great point, and body language means a lot. So, again, in my world, and I think you adjust to your situation, right? Everything is going to have certain patterns. So, in my world, for example, again, you feel this sense of hurry. It's there's never enough time, and so I see so many of my colleagues who give body language that they don't have the time to be here very long. So they'll literally, maybe be standing there leaning towards the door or slowly backing out. Or I've often seen them with one foot out the door, all with this body language saying, I got to get out of here. I can't. And I always advise people with the really hard conversations, you got to go sit down. You got to sit down in front of the people, with the people, and show that you are not trying to get out of there as fast as possible. So I am sure there are parallels in the various types of industries where you adapt to whatever the conventions are that clearly signals, I am here for you for this, and we are taking this very seriously, and I'm here until we come to some sort of solution on it.
Yeah, that kind of body language and positioning are just so important. I'll always tell people to sit on the same side or at 90-degree angle rather than facing, because it just feels so much more combative, depending on what the topic is. If you are face-to-face or if you're standing and they're sitting, holy moly, what a message that gives. So that's all good stuff. So can we switch gears for a moment and tell me a little bit about the book that you've recently written?
Well, yeah, sure. Thank you. So I guess it'll be a longer story than you want, maybe, but through the last 10, 15 years, I became very interested in burnout because I see so much of it in healthcare. And it's ubiquitous. And if you look at the data, it's very supportive. And they tell us that 50% of all physicians are burning out to one degree or another. And I believe it to one degree or another. And got really interested and was lucky enough to work with a world expert on physician burnout. His name's Wayne Sotil. So anyway, we wrote 3 books on burnout in healthcare. And I think it's a good service, and I think they're good books and all that. But they're still nonfiction, and all you do in medicine is write nonfiction. For on one level or another. Your patient reports, things you write for your national organizations and your journals and stuff like that. And it really starts to feel like a book report. So anyway, I dove into the fiction world, but that burnout world crawled into my fictional attempt. So it's about a brain surgeon of all people who is overworked, overtaxed, probably burning out, who begins to see things. He thinks they're hallucinations initially, and then convinces himself that they're ghosts. And then things kind of take off from there.
Fun. That's quite a transition going from being a surgeon to a fiction author.
Yeah, I guess. Probably we weave a lot of fiction about ourselves throughout our careers. So maybe it's not such a big leap.
Absolutely. So on the topic of burnout, it's, I'm sure it's very common with physicians and in the medical field, but it's pretty common elsewhere also. Are there any tips or advice you have from your studies that can apply to us?
Oh, yeah, whole books. But I think, it is absolutely not the purview of people in medicine. In other words, I think you're right. It's all over the place. I think our society makes us quite prone to it. We're just moving at the speed of light. We're multitasked like crazy. Burnout is people are particularly susceptible, who are bright, energized, hard pushing, driven, who are in high demand, low control situations, and that describes many of our lives, right? That we're put into that situation. So I do think it's ubiquitous. It plays out, technically it plays out as a sense of emotional exhaustion and loss of empathy and loss of sense of accomplishment. And people can kind of drown in that, just lose all sense of energy to get out there and do what their normal days demand, let alone the higher demand stuff. So I'm sure. And so we have a list of dozens and dozens of strategies to work at to try to help people pull themselves out of burnout and to build what we call their resilience. And that is the ability to face all these challenges and not, be emptied out. So building resilience is the key. And I just give you kind of, again, the opening salvo. The opening salvo is to grant oneself permission to practice what we call self-compassion. And it's a little bit of psychobabble, meaning to actually sit down periodically and think about oneself. We're in this, mile a minute world. And if we ever say to ourselves, geez, I wonder how this makes me feel, we kind of go, oh, shut up, get your job done. Stop being a baby. Or we fill ourselves with guilt because we should be focusing on other things. But periodically, without guilt, we have to sit down and say, where am I? How am I feeling? How am I doing? What brings me pleasure and joy? What is dragging me down? What is sucking the energy right out of me? What relationships are bringing me value? What is going on, in various entities of my life that are working well? What aren't working so well? How do I respond to these stressors that seem to be bringing me down? Are my responses good for me, or are my responses adding fuel to the fire? So in other words, periodically, even if we have to sit down with a piece of paper and write pieces out, taking an inventory of ourselves, because we would argue you can't really address burnout, you can't really address yourself without understanding yourself. So part one is coming to understand yourself. Part two, which is a work in progress. You can't just do it once and, I have it all solved. And part two is then granting yourself permission to actually do something about it. And so I'll give you one of 70 or 80 examples that we give. But the examples that we use for strategies that one can practice are developed through looking at going kind of what they call positive psychology, not studying the people who are having trouble, but studying the people who are not burning out. What are they doing that they're not burning out? So here's one example, and we call it the 90-10 rule. It probably should be called the 99.99 versus 0.001 rule. But what we mean is if you look at your world and look at your stressors, it's very easy to quickly identify that many of them are external. It's your work schedule. It's, this evil boss. It's the impossible tasks that you're required in the medical world. It's the electronic medical record. Everybody wants to take it to the woodshed and smash it to pieces. One thing or after another. It's this external world leaning on us and sucking every last bit of energy out of us. And so what we say is, okay, let's grant ourselves that the grand majority is external. And it would be nice to get that fixed, and we should try to get it fixed as systems and all. But for us personally, is there any piece of this that we can lay claim to and work on improving so that we can say, I'm not just completely a victim of circumstances. I have some control over some piece of the puzzle, and I'm going to make that tiny piece better. Because A, it gives us a little bit of that sense of control back. B, is it makes that little piece better. C, is it may start spreading. It may start having a ripples in a pond effect that, okay, my mini work micro environment is me and 3 other people. What if I actually just start being nice to those 3 people and complimenting them about their work every day? We may find that they all of a sudden start blossoming and working better and, improving our microenvironment as well. So that would be one example, Jeremy.
I like it. And it's always amazing how often we tell ourselves that we have to do a certain thing. And if you stop and look, it's like there are very few things that you have to do. If you're a surgeon, then yeah, you should be doing that surgery. But a lot of times we say, oh, I have to get this thing done. And if you stop and think about it, no, I don't. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? The world will continue to move on. So I think that's a big one. And then you talked about, sometimes just taking any small step just feels so invigorating. Even if that step didn't really result in anything, just the fact of taking that step usually goes a long way. So that's great stuff. All right, we are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to wrap up with the 3 questions I like to ask everyone. First one is part A and B. What is a place you've traveled to and loved, and a place that you haven't been yet but want to go?
I do love going to Britain. My mother was Scottish, and I lived there for a while as a boy. And I love going way out into the hinterlands and traipsing around these places. It's always raining, by the way, but traipsing around these places where ancient humans put up rows of stones and circles of stones and stuff like that. We also like going to the oldest pub in town and just thinking about how people have been, coming into this place for 600 years, 700 years. I don't know, it just puts you in touch with your humanity. I've always wanted to go to one of, a place like Auschwitz, one of the concentration camp areas, just, I don't know, to pay my respects, I guess.
There are not a lot of 700-year-old pubs in America.
No, not a lot.
Great. And the second question is, who do you find to be a great communicator? And it can be a public figure or just someone in your personal life.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot. I could give you an amalgam more. I mean, if you want to go historical, I still love I love hearing Churchill's speeches. To me, Shakespeare, if you're communicating and writing, Shakespeare was probably the best. He kind of plumbed every human emotion and motivation back several hundred years ago. I don't think we've changed at all. But I was lucky enough to train and practice in the Army for a while, and I in my work there, I had so many colleagues who came out of West Point. I don't know what it is about West Point. I guess it's all their leadership training. But you want to talk great communicators. I think, it goes to one of the lessons about good communication, that it just felt like they were so straightforward that, a lie could never leave their lips. So that honesty angle, it's so pure, it would always make me feel inferior. but I think, they I guess they just commanded respect by, their honesty and, I guess, professionalism and competence.
And then the final question is, what's one piece of communication advice that we can all benefit from?
Well, we hit a major one, and then maybe I'll add some spice. But I think the listening angle is huge. I think we are, even when we are hearing somebody, we're already formulating what we're going to say in our own minds. So, that's all going on. And our brains aren't very good at focusing on two things at once. So I might argue, that we actually make ourselves listen and truly listen. Don't worry about what you're going to say until you've listened and processed it. I also think in many settings, not all, because some it's inappropriate, but I think in many settings, a little dash of humor goes a huge way. I think it humanizes you, it connects you with the people, and so I think it's really powerful. You want it to be self-deprecating, not focused on them, obviously. Sometimes you can have a mutual enemy, like when I would be with the patients. Sometimes I had to be typing while I'm talking to them, and I would say, hey, sorry I'm doing this, but if I don't feed this, monster, it will eat us both alive, or something like that. And they seem to appreciate that. But for the most part, I think a little dose of self-deprecating humor goes a huge way. What are your pieces, Jeremy? If you're going to ask me, I get to answer it back or ask it back at you.
Sure. So listening is a big one. Talk about it a lot on this podcast. And as you said, listening all the way to the end and not trying to come up with what your answer is going to be before you've gotten all the way to the end. And another thing that I'll say is you may not agree with what the person's saying, but you have to accept that it's their truth. So even if you disagree, but you accept that it is their truth, then it puts you on a much more stable ground for the communication that you have going forward.
I like that. I like that a lot. There's an interesting, just a sidelight to that one, reference the novel. They told me, because I read all these books about it and all, but I don't know who they is even, but somebody once said, and then it gets repeated a lot, but once you release the novel, it's not yours anymore. That, no matter what you thought these people were doing or what their motivations were, whoever reads it is going to put it into their own world, their own universe. And it's delightful when you talk to them about it and hear all these various interpretations and all. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, that's much better than mine. Yeah, we'll go with that one. Where are your travel to places?
Oh, I would love to go to Australia. And I lived in Italy for a year. And when I went to Finland, I fell in love with it. I was staying at a just tiny hostel surrounded by forest and lakes. And you would think that you were in the middle of nowhere, but 20-minute bus ride, you're in Helsinki. It was really cool. So it's a lot better in summer than it is in winter, but I was there in winter too, and I liked it still. So
yeah, I can bet. Well, I'm heading to southern Switzerland in May with Virginia Tech, with a class I teach with Virginia Tech, but it's real close to Como.
Yeah, nice.
Lake Como, and so it's delightful out there.
Wonderful. Well, have fun out there. Gary, how can people find out more about you and or reach out to you?
Very easy. I thank you for asking. I have my own website, which is probably not all that professional. Sorry, but it's it's the best I can do. But it's under my name, Gary R. Simonds, Simonds. So it's GaryRSimonds.com. So that's
wonderful.
That makes it pretty easy. And I love connecting with people, and I love having these sort of conversations. I think the more all of us do this, the better we understand each other and the better we function, all together.
Perfect. Gary, it has been a pleasure. I'm going to put in the show notes a link to your website as well so that people can find it easier. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it is truly my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of How to Talk to Weirdos. Hopefully you found it both interesting and useful. If either of those things is true, please share. Do you have a friend or a coworker who could benefit from listening? Maybe a family member you're going to be spending the holidays with? please send them a link to your favorite episode and see if your conversations don't get just a little bit easier. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a great week.